This is a History of Western Thought, number 15, Aristotle on Causality. In our last video, we began our study of Aristotle, and if you haven't watched that, I would urge you to watch that prior to this video, which expands upon some of those themes. So we talked in the last video about hylomorphism, Aristotle's perspective on the world that all things are made up of both form and matter. And today we continue looking at his metaphysics as we examine the four causes according to the Greek philosopher. Most of the time when we use the term cause, we have one particular thing in mind. When we say that something is the cause of something else, we mean that in time, one thing happens, and once that one thing happens, usually a second thing happens afterwards. And so as we explain, for example, that I knock my coffee on the floor because I'm gesturing with my arm and smack it and it falls on the floor and the coffee spills, you can ask the question, well, what was the cause of the spilled coffee on the floor? And the answer would be the waving of my arm. And so one event temporally precedes another, and we refer to that as the cause of another thing. So the effect grows directly out of the cause. Well, when Aristotle uses the term cause, he means it in a number of different ways, and he has four different ways of speaking about causes. Now, it is only one of those, the efficient cause, which really has similarity to how we tend to use the language of causation today, as in the example I mentioned. And the first two of these causes are related to this idea of hylomorphism, or all things being made up of both form and matter. The first cause is the material cause. Now, the material cause refers to the matter or the stuff which a thing is made of. So we'll continue with the example of a table that we used in the last video and say that the matter which makes up a table, if it's made of wood, is the wood, is the stuff that actually makes up the material. That is the physical stuff, though it doesn't have to be physical in Aristotle's language. So if you have a plastic table, it would be the plastic that makes up the table. But in this example, it is wood. The formal cause is the form that the thing takes, so the shape that it takes, the thing that it is. And so we would understand that if you have a pile of wood on the ground, though you have matter, and it has not been built into anything, that you couldn't refer to that wood as a table or a desk or a chair, because it does not have the form of those things. And so the formal cause would refer, in our example of a table, to the shape of the table. And so you take the matter, and it is formed into a particular form or a particular shape that is table. And so that is the formal cause. The third is the efficient cause. And we'll get into this in a little more detail. But just to summarize quickly, an efficient cause is what we generally speak of as cause in our regular language. So we'd say, what is the cause of, say, the table coming into existence? The cause of that table coming into existence is perhaps the individual who put the table together. That person is the efficient cause because it was their work that resulted in the matter taking the form of table. Now, the fourth cause is going to be especially important as we look at Aristotle's view of nature, and will be particularly influential as we move into the medieval period, and that is this notion of final causes. So what exactly is a final cause? Well, the final cause identifies the thing for which something is, the thing that it is moving toward, or the telos, the end, the goal of a thing. So, if we're speaking about the example of table, generally we use tables for things like eating. So we could say that the final cause is for eating. The purpose of the putting together of the table, the reason why someone made the table in the first place, was for the purpose that a family or whoever is using the table could use it to have a meal. Now, Aristotle uses this distinction in a number of different ways, and it becomes a very influential category, especially in the later medieval period when people are explaining theology or science or philosophy to identify things with reference to what these four causes are. Now, as we've already talked a bit about matter and form in the previous video, we're going to look at Aristotle's notion of efficient causality and final causality. The idea of efficient causes is one that becomes a controversial subject in philosophy later on, especially as we look at the Enlightenment period and people like David Hume who are highly critical of Aristotle's notion of efficient causality. We have to clarify something because of David Hume's criticism often leads to some misunderstandings of exactly what Aristotle was saying when he spoke of an efficient cause. Now, for David Hume, later on, when we speak of something as a cause, we are talking temporally. We are speaking about one act in time being followed by another act in time. So that in our ordinary human experience, we note that when one thing happens, another thing often follows. Say, when I put a piece of food in my mouth and bite down with my teeth, that food tends to break or become chewed. So as the process of human life occurs and we experience regular causes and results of those things, we expect a kind of regularity in terms of how the natural and physical world works. And generally that does certainly seem to be the case. But for Aristotle, it's not always the case that these things have to be temporally linked, in that it doesn't have to be that the efficient cause happens sometime prior to the actual event itself or the result of that cause. For example, think about the nature of chewing food, as I already mentioned. As the teeth bite down and the food is chewed, these things are actually occurring at the same moment. And we have the cause, that is the teeth and the closing of the mouth, and we have the effect that arises from that, which is the food being broken or chewed. And so we have at the same time both a cause and an effect. And so when Aristotle is speaking of causes, think of it not so much linearly in time, think about it more so hierarchically. As events are happening, what thing is causing the other thing that is happening at that moment? If you see, for example, a train moving a bunch of cars, you may ask, well, what's the cause of the motion of the train? Now, the front of the train and the cars behind it are moving at exactly the same time. But it would be foolish, as you would probably know, to say that the cars would be the thing that is moving the train, because they do not have the power of motion in themselves. This then leads to another really important distinction, that is Aristotle's attempt to answer the question, how is it that there is both constancy and change in the world, as we've been looking at throughout this series so far? And as we looked at in Plato believed that the answer for that is the notion that there are these unchanging forms, that is in the realm of ideals, and the particular objects experience change, but also they experience constancy insofar as they are still connected to that ideal. Now, Aristotle has a little bit of a different way of explaining how change occurs in the world along with consistency or constancy in the world. And that is through a distinction that he makes between act and potency. Potency, or potentiality, is what an object has the potential to be or to do. For example, if I have a cup of coffee next to me, which I do at the moment, that coffee has the potentiality to be drunk by me. However, it is not right now because it's sitting on the table. Now, that potentiality to be drunk can become actualized. It has the possibility to do that. Now, how does that happen? Well, an agent outside of the coffee, something outside of it, must be the thing that then actualizes that potentiality. So if I pick up that cup of coffee, put it to my mouth, and take a drink, now I am actualizing something that actually exists within that coffee. That is the potentiality to be drunk. Now, objects don't have infinite potentialities. There is nothing inherent in coffee that coffee could become a llama if I did something magical to it. That's why we would call it magic, because we know it's impossible for the physical object to actually do that. It doesn't have the kind of properties that would lend itself to doing that kind of thing. And so all things exist both as a mixture of act and potency. Just as all things are composite of matter and form, so are all things composite of both act and potency. As I am recording this, I am actualizing my potentiality to be seated at a chair in front of a microphone and speak these words. But right now, I have plenty of other potentialities that are not being actualized. For example, standing up, walking around the room, screaming, falling asleep. These are all things that I can do, I have the ability to do, but they are not currently being actualized. So this is Aristotle's way of saying that when something changes, it doesn't need to become something totally different in order to change. It simply is something that exists within the object that can be actualized at any given moment. So if things are made up of both act and potency, we can see then how the object can experience change while remaining the same object. It is the same object, but now some of its potencies have been actualized and others have not. So if I stand up, now my potentiality to be standing has been actualized, but now I am no longer sitting, which means that now I have another potentiality that is now not actualized that was actualized previously. And so this distinction between act and potency really makes a lot of sense of what we experience in the world around us, that things have inherent to themselves abilities to be certain places, to move in certain ways. People have potentiality to say certain things, to think various things, but that those things are not always the case. And when some potentiality is actualized in a given thing, it happens through the intervention or the movement of another object. The potentiality of my coffee to be drunk is not something that it can actually fulfill by itself. It needs an outside force in order to do that. And that would be me as the one drinking the coffee who has to be the one to actualize that potentiality in a given thing. Now, it is important to say that when we're speaking about these efficient causes being the things which actualize the potency in other things, because that's what we're talking about as an efficient cause, the efficient cause makes the potency into act, we don't have to limit this to one singular cause. Generally, when we talk about an efficient cause, we speak about a primary cause, but we can also talk about secondary causes. So one event does not necessarily have one singular cause, but can often have many causes. If you think, for example, about a world war, one of the first two world wars, there are a number of historical factors and events that have to occur in order for that event to be kicked off in the way that it was. There was a certain development of warfare technologies, communications across the world, tensions raising in a number of different nations over a number of different ideas before that potentiality for a world war to occur has actually been actualized. So we could talk about a primary cause of any given historical event and then several secondary causes that are involved in that as well. And now let's explore the last of Aristotle's causes, and that is appropriately named the final cause. And as I mentioned before, if we're talking about an object that a human person makes, like a table, the final cause is the purpose for which the thing was created. And this may be pretty easy to see when we're talking about purposeful beings like humans creating objects, that of course we often have a goal in mind in what we do. But the question goes beyond just human creation, because for Aristotle, there is a final cause in nature. The objects of nature, human persons, body parts, plants, animals, seasons, these all have final causes built into them, which means that for Aristotle, the universe is teleological. This is opposed to a mechanistic view of the universe. Mechanistic view says that the world is essentially like a machine. All the parts just kind of work together, but for no real goal or purpose. A teleological view of nature says that there is meaning and purpose in all events that occur. Let's look at an example. And this is the example I used before, but one that Aristotle himself uses. And that is the example of teeth. Why is it that the teeth that humans have, the front teeth, are really good for chewing a piece of meat or a piece of food off, and then the back teeth work very well for chewing more intensely? Well, it certainly seems to function pretty well. The mouth appears as if it has been created for a particular purpose in mind, and that is that the teeth exist for the sake of, or for the purpose of, chewing food, that it may be swallowed, and the purpose of swallowing is there so that the body may be nourished by the things that the food does for the body through nutrients and so forth. Then we could also say that the nutrients that are given to the body are for the life of the body, so that the body itself can flourish and do other things. When we're speaking about final causes, we can go on and on and on and say that there is purpose within the natural world, purpose within the things that exist in the world. So we could say, for example, that the human being has eyes, and those eyes are not just an object that happens to see, but the eyes are actually for seeing. That is their purpose. But this does not just have to do with people or animals. We can speak about this in the plant world, for example, as well. So think about just a natural process, something like the process of photosynthesis. Now, in the process of photosynthesis, as you've learned about probably in elementary school and maybe haven't looked into much since, we have a plant that takes in light. Now, it needs to take in light so that it can turn that light energy into chemical energy, so that it can then fuel the various activities of that plant afterwards. This does not mean, Aristotle does not mean, that the plant has some kind of purpose in mind. It's not that there is a plant intellect and the plant says, well, I really need to get some light from the sun so I can convert that energy so that it will allow me to grow. This is not something the plant is capable of doing. It just does it as a natural organism. So it's not that there is a will inherent in the natural world, but that there is purpose actually built into things that exist. And so there are goals, there are purposes, and that means there is meaning in all things that occur in this world. So to summarize Aristotle's position here, we see that as Aristotle describes causes and effects in the world, he sees meaning and purpose in all that occurs. And this is set up very much against how the post-Enlightenment world would later see the universe as simply a physical machine and human beings as just part of that machine with no inherent purpose or meaning at all, only to try to create some kind of meaning for ourselves. We will continue next time looking at Aristotle's approach to the virtues.